"Sir, this is a live-fire range. What do you think you're doing here?" The voice was sharp, laced with the kind of condescending authority only a young man with brand-new lieutenant bars on his collar could muster. He stood with his hands on his hips, his perfectly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the dusty, worn-out jacket of the old man he was addressing. The old man, whose name was Arthur, simply stood near the observation line, his gaze fixed on the distant targets shimmering in the heat haze. His hands, clasped loosely in front of him, had a fine, persistent tremor, a detail Lieutenant Davies noted with a curl of his lip. "Did you hear me, old-timer? This isn't the VFW hall. People could get hurt." A few of the young soldiers under Davies' command snickered. They were a captive audience, watching their platoon leader dress down the civilian who had apparently wandered out of the designated visitors area. Arthur slowly turned his head, his pale blue eyes, cloudy with age but clear with a quiet intelligence, meeting the lieutenants. He didn't speak. He simply offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the lieutenant's presence but not the validity of his tone. This silent defiance seemed to stoke Davies' irritation. "Look, I don't have time for this. We're running advanced marksmanship drills. This is for real soldiers, not for, well, not for tourists." He gestured vaguely at Arthur's frail-looking frame. "I'm sure you were a big deal back in your day, whatever war that was. But things have changed. The weapons, the optics, the distances. It's a different world." Arthur's gaze drifted back to the range. He could see the setup clearly. 7 targets, placed at varying, extreme distances. The final one, nearly a mile out, was a reactive steel plate no bigger than a dinner plate, partially obscured by a simulated barricade. It was a brutal course of fire, designed to separate the exceptional from the merely competent. The tremor in his hands seemed to worsen slightly as he watched, a palsied dance of knuckles and fingers. One of the young privates, emboldened by his leader's arrogance, whispered loudly to his buddy, "Look at his hands shake. He probably couldn't even hold a cup of coffee, let alone that," nodding towards the high-powered sniper rifle a sergeant was currently cleaning. The laughter was a little louder this time. Lieutenant Davies smiled, feeling he had control of the situation, that he was putting on a good show for his men. He decided to press his advantage, to make an example of the old man's irrelevance. "See those targets out there, Grandpa?" Davies said, his voice dripping with mock patience. "That last one, we call it the ghost. Top snipers in the battalion have trouble with it on a good day. It requires a steady hand, perfect breath control, and an understanding of ballistics you wouldn't believe." He leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for his men to hear. "With hands like those, you'd be lucky to hit the ground in front of you." Arthur's expression didn't change. He remained a statue of quiet endurance, absorbing the insults like a weathered rock absorbs the rain. He had heard worse, from men who meant it, in places that had stolen the steadiness from his hands. This boy's words were just noise, empty brass clattering on concrete. But the disrespect wasn't just for him. It was for the uniform he once wore, for the sacrifices that had aged him beyond his years. He finally spoke, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, dry from disuse. "It's a difficult shot," he conceded, his eyes still on the range. "Wind's tricky today." Coming over that ridge from 2 o'clock, the simple observation, delivered with an air of absolute certainty, momentarily silenced the lieutenant. Davies hadn't even checked the windage flags in the last 10 minutes. He glanced at them now, seeing the slight flutter that confirmed the old man's assessment. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face. He didn't like being corrected, especially on a detail he'd overlooked. "Yeah, well, a lot of good that observation does you," he snapped, recovering his bluster. "Why don't you head on back to the visitor center and get yourself some lemonade? Leave the serious work to the men who can actually do it." He turned his back on Arthur, a clear sign of dismissal, and addressed his squad. "All right, listen up. Peterson, you're up first. Let's see if you can do better than the last magazine. Remember what I said, a steady hand is a disciplined mind." As he spoke, a black sedan with official base markings rolled up the dusty track and parked behind the firing line. The rear door opened, and a man in a crisp, starched uniform emerged. He was tall and imposing, with the silver eagle of a full colonel on his shoulders and a chest full of ribbons that told a story of a long and distinguished career. It was Colonel Vance, the base commander. Lieutenant Davies's back straightened instantly. His arrogant posture melted into one of rigid, formal attention. "Colonel, sir." "Unexpected pleasure," he barked, striding over and throwing a salute that was perhaps a little too sharp, a little too eager. Colonel Vance returned the salute with practiced ease, but his eyes weren't on the young lieutenant. They were scanning the area, and they came to rest on the old man in the worn jacket, still standing by the observation line. The colonel's stern, authoritative expression dissolved. It was replaced by something else entirely, a look of profound, almost reverent, respect. The hardness in his eyes softened, and a genuine smile touched his lips. He ignored Davies completely and walked straight towards Arthur. "Sergeant Major," the colonel said, his voice warm and filled with an emotion the young soldiers had never heard from their commander. "I had a feeling I might find you out here. They told me you were on base today." He extended his hand, not in the perfunctory way an officer might greet a civilian, but with the deep respect one warrior shows another. Arthur's trembling hand met the colonel's firm one. "Just watching the boys, Frank," Arthur rasped. Seeing how the new generation shoots, Lieutenant Davies stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. "Sergeant Major?" This frail old man. He watched as Colonel Vance, his own commander, stood talking with the man he had just belittled, his posture deferential, his tone respectful. The snickering among the troops had died instantly, replaced by a confused, uneasy silence. They exchanged nervous glances, the casual cruelty of a few moments ago now curdling into a knot of dread in their stomachs. The world had just tilted on its axis. Colonel Vance finally turned his attention to the pale-faced lieutenant. His friendly demeanor vanished, replaced by an icy calm that was far more terrifying than any shouting. "Lieutenant Davies," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "What exactly were you telling the sergeant major?" Davies swallowed hard. "Sir, I was unaware of the sergeant major's identity. I was simply explaining the range safety protocols. Sir, it was a weak lie, and everyone knew it." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "Is that so? Because from where I was standing, it looked like you were explaining how a real soldier acts. It looked like you were mocking a man whose boots you are not worthy to polish. It looked," he paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, "like you were disrespecting a living legend." The air grew thick with tension. The young soldiers stared at their boots, wishing the ground would swallow them. Colonel Vance wasn't finished. He turned to the assembled platoon. "Do any of you know who this is?" he asked, his voice booming across the range. "Have you spent so much time on video games and simulations that you don't recognize history when it's standing right in front of you?" No one answered. "This," the colonel said, placing a hand on Arthur's shoulder, "is Sergeant Major Arthur Wells. He was one of the original 16 founding members of the unit you kids only know by its code name. Before you were born, he was operating in places that don't exist on your maps. He held the line at a battle your history books reduced to a single paragraph, earning a Distinguished Service Cross for holding off an entire enemy company, alone, for 6 hours after his team was wiped out." The colonel pointed towards the rifle range. "You see that rifle Peterson is holding? Sergeant Major Wells helped test the prototype. He wrote half the doctrine on long-range marksmanship that you studied today. His confirmed kill count is classified at a level you don't have the clearance to read about. The record for this very range, on a target set up twice as difficult as this one, was set by him in 1978. It has never been broken." He then looked directly at Arthur's trembling hands. "And you see this tremor, Lieutenant?" he said, his voice dropping again, filled with a cold fury. "He wasn't born with that. He got that after pulling 2 of his men out of a burning helicopter under heavy fire. He got that from the shrapnel that's still embedded in his spine. He got that from sacrificing his body for the very freedoms that give you the right to stand here and disrespect him." Lieutenant Davies's face was ashen. The foundation of his world, built on his own perceived superiority and the rigid hierarchy of rank, had crumbled into dust. He looked at Arthur, truly looked at him for the first time, and saw not a frail old man, but a monument of sacrifice. The quiet dignity now made sense. The patient endurance was not weakness, but a strength he couldn't possibly comprehend. The shame was so profound it was a physical sensation, a burning heat that spread from his chest to his face. He wanted to apologize, to say something, but the words wouldn't come. His throat was tight with self-loathing. Arthur seemed to sense the shift in the air. He looked from the humiliated lieutenant to the awestruck faces of the young soldiers. He knew this moment was a crossroads for them. It could be a source of shame, or it could be a lesson. He gave Colonel Vance a slight nod. The colonel understood immediately. "Sergeant Major," he said formally, "I apologize for my officer's conduct. He is young and foolish. He's green, Frank. We were all green once," Arthur said, his voice forgiving. Then, an idea seemed to spark in the colonel's eyes. It was a cruel idea, but perhaps a necessary one. "A lesson taught is better than a punishment given. Lieutenant Davies," the colonel said, "you seem to be an expert on steady hands. You made it clear that the sergeant major, in his condition, couldn't possibly handle one of these weapons." Davies flinched as if struck. "Sir, silence," the colonel commanded. He turned to Arthur. "Sergeant Major, would you do us the honor? I believe the lieutenant and his men could benefit from a practical demonstration." A murmur went through the squad. Arthur looked down at his own trembling hands, then back at the range. For a long moment, he was silent. Then he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I suppose I could take a few shots," he said quietly. For the boys, a sergeant, his face a mask of reverence, quickly brought over a top-of-the-line M2010 sniper rifle, the same model Davies had been boasting about. He offered it to Arthur with the care one would use to handle a holy relic. Arthur took the rifle. His hands shook as he gripped the stock, the tremor more pronounced than ever. He fumbled with the magazine, his fingers seeming clumsy and uncooperative. Davies watched, a fresh wave of horror washing over him. He had made this happen. He had forced this legend, this hero, to perform like a circus animal to correct his own unforgivable ignorance. But then, something incredible happened. Arthur moved to the firing mat and settled into a prone position. As he brought the rifle to his shoulder and settled his cheek against the stock, a transformation occurred. It was as if a current of electricity ran through him, steadying every nerve, calming every muscle. The tremor in his hands vanished. It didn't just lessen, it ceased to exist. His body became a part of the earth, an unmoving platform of bone and sinew. He was no longer a frail old man. He was the instrument of a singular, deadly purpose. He adjusted the scope with a fluid, practiced motion, his breathing slowing until it was barely perceptible. The silence on the range was absolute. The only sound was the wind, the same wind he had identified earlier, whispering over the ridge. He chambered around. The metallic click-clack was unnaturally loud in the stillness. He took a breath, let half of it out, and the world seemed to hold it with him. The first shot was a sharp, clean crack that echoed across the valley. Almost instantly, the electronic sensor for the first target, a man-sized silhouette at 800 meters, flashed green. A perfect center mass hit. Without breaking his form, he worked the bolt, chambered another round, acquired the next target. Crack. Green flash. 1,000 meters. Crack. Green flash. 1,200 meters, a moving target. He flowed from one target to the next with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. He wasn't just shooting. He was conducting a symphony of violence. The fourth, fifth, and sixth targets fell in the same rapid, impossibly precise succession. The soldiers stared, their mouths hanging open. They were witnessing something that defied belief, a level of skill they had only read about. Finally, only one target remained. The ghost, the small steel plate at nearly a mile, dancing in the mirage, partially hidden. No one on the base had hit it on their first try all year. Arthur paused for a fraction of a second longer, his eye pressed to the scope. The wind gusted, and he made a minuscule adjustment to his aim, a movement so slight it was almost invisible. Then, the seventh shot rang out. For 3 long, agonizing seconds, there was nothing but the fading echo of the rifle. Then, a faint ping carried back on the wind, followed a moment later by the green flash of the sensor. A direct hit. Dead center. 7 targets. 7 shots. 7 perfect hits. Arthur remained in position for a moment longer before smoothly working the bolt to eject the final spent casing. He then pushed himself up from the mat. As he stood, the transformation reversed. The iron stillness left him, and the quiet, persistent tremor returned to his hands, as if it had only been waiting patiently for him to finish. He laid the rifle gently back on its stand and turned to face the stunned audience. The entire platoon, including Colonel Vance, stood in speechless awe. The silence was broken by a single, sharp sound. Lieutenant Davies had dropped to one knee. He was trying to speak, but his voice was choked with emotion. He finally managed to get the words out, his head bowed in utter subjugation. "Sergeant Major. Sir. There are no words. I am so sorry. My disrespect. It was unforgivable. I am ashamed." Arthur walked over to him, his steps slow and deliberate. He looked down at the young officer, not with anger or triumph, but with a deep, weary sadness. "Get up, son," he said, his voice gentle. The lieutenant rose, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "That rank on your collar," Arthur said, tapping Davies' shoulder. "It gives you authority, but it doesn't give you respect. That you have to earn. You earn it by how you treat people. Not just colonels and generals, but everyone. The private who cleans the latrines, the cook in the mess hall. The old man you think has nothing left to teach you." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The most important target is never on the range. It's the arrogance in your own heart. You have to be willing to destroy that every single day." Colonel Vance stepped forward. "Lieutenant Davies, you have a choice. I can file a formal report on this incident, which will effectively end your career. Or you can accept a reassignment." "I'll take the reassignment, sir," Davies said without hesitation, his voice thick with humility. "Anything good," the colonel said. "Your new duty, effective immediately, is to serve as my personal liaison for the Veterans Outreach Program. Your first task is to spend the next month as Sergeant Major Wells's personal aide. You will drive him where he needs to go. You will listen to his stories. You will learn everything he is willing to teach you. And you will learn what it truly means to serve. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir. Crystal clear, sir." "Thank you, sir," Davies said, the gratitude in his voice absolute. He knew he was being given a second chance, a path to redemption he did not deserve. Later that afternoon, the firing range was empty. In the small base canteen, Arthur sat at a table with a cup of coffee. His hands trembled as he lifted it to his lips. Across from him sat Lieutenant Davies, a notebook and pen in his hands, his uniform jacket off, his posture no longer rigid but attentive. He wasn't looking at the old man's shaking hands anymore. He was looking into his eyes, listening with an intensity he had never before afforded another human being, as Arthur began to tell him about a place a long way from there, and a time when his hands had been perfectly, terrifyingly steady.